Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 4, Mirage, Part 2. They all gazed at the elevator, now standing before them, wide open, wondering what on earth it could be for. Beck was the first one to break the silence. Well, fuck that. I'm not going in there. Who knows where that goes? Who knows what'll be on the other side of the door whenever it opens back up? She let out a small, sarcastic laugh and added, if it opens up. Yeah, but think about it. This might lead to the safe harbor the broadcast was telling us about, Trevor said as he tried to calm her fear. She looked at her brother and rolled her eyes. Trev, if the safe harbor is really down there, why on earth would we have to hack our way in? Especially if they're announcing mass invitations over a radio. Trevor looked back at his sister while thinking of a good response to her very, very excellent points. Why do you have to use logic on me? It's such a waste of time. She smiled, crossed her arms and walked outside. Jack then chimed in. No, this looks like some kind of military-style underground laboratory. He then reached down to the duffel bag and picked up a radio. He handed it to Trevor. Trevor looked at the radio, then back to Jack. Will these even work underground? Jack, while looking at the radio, pointed at it and replied, Son, these things will work anywhere. They're the latest in military technology. They can communicate with each other miles under the earth and completely around it. Trevor nodded. Huh, really? Jack quickly responded. Yep. So long as they're on the same channel. They can even track each other by GPS to one another's precise locations. Just then, Seth joined into the conversation. I'll go with you. Eugene joined in as well. Count me in. Jack reached down to the duffel bag, picked it up, and announced, "I've got one back in the plane. It's still set to channel 38, like it has been for weeks. Make sure yours is the same. I'll be listening in. Anything goes wrong, Joe and I will come for you. Right, Joe?" Joe sighed and put his hands in his pockets. "Sure thing." With that, Jack and Joe turned and walked out of the room to join up with Beck. Alone in the dark room, the three men stared into the perplexing green-lit elevator. Eugene motioned the other two in. "Ladies first." Trevor and Seth hesitated for a second, and then walked into the metallic sarcophagus. They turned and looked at Eugene. He quickly did something with the wiring in the black box to the right of the elevator shaft, and then promptly jumped in to join his two friends. The elevator doors slowly closed. They stood there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. They noticed there were lights above that were intended to make the elevator a much brighter space. With power grids down all over the world, this green light must be a more energy-conserving one, powered by a backup generator. A few more seconds went by when they heard the unsettling sounds of chains rattle from behind the walls that surrounded them. The elevator was finally moving and picking up speed rather quickly. "Hear me, okay?" "Over." A crackly sound came from the radio. Trevor turned a knob on the radio, pushed a button, and held it close to his mouth. "Yeah, we got you. Over." Back on the surface, by the plane, Jack and Joe were sitting on two camping chairs next to each other, just outside the still open door of the plane, listening to Trevor respond over the radio. Beck, Anne, Caleb, and Delilah were all sitting on a blanket a short distance away, enjoying a little makeshift picnic and playing a kid's card game. Joe proceeded to scan the surroundings beyond the large fences that confined them. He looked into the thick jungle on all sides of them with a suspicious expression that washed over his face. He didn't care for how they were in the open, completely vulnerable to whomever may be watching from the dark, wooded areas. Jack continued the radio dialogue. "Keep us updated. I don't want to hear you go dark. We don't want any false alarms. Keep talking. Let us know what you're seeing. We'll be listening. Over." Back in the elevator, Trevor, still with his radio to his mouth and his thumb hovering over the button used to transmit his voice, waited for Jack to finish his instructions. When he heard the word "over," he quickly pressed the button to talk. "Got it. We're still in the elevator. It's moving really fast, but I think we're okay. It must go down pretty deep." "Over." "Yeah. These underground military labs can be very deep. Let us know when you hit bottom." "Over." A staticky Jack requested. Trevor responded in kind. "You got it, old man. Over." Suddenly, the three men's worst-case scenario came speedily true as the elevator's lights began flickering. The three of them stared helplessly at the ceiling as they felt the apparent feeling of the elevator coming loose from its cables. The elevator picked up a much greater speed and began careening down, its shaft being jarred as it slammed into one side of the shaft after another. Eventually, the once perfectly rectangular-shaped metal box began to tweak and take on an entirely different shape as the cement shaft walls began to fold it like an origami. Sparks from the elevator car and the cement walls surrounding it lit up the dark shaft in a dizzying array of orange and yellow light. Eventually, the carriage began to slow as it became wedged between the walls. Inside, the men hunched over and looking upward, kept their eyes out for the ceiling to possibly cave in around them and crush them to death. They felt the friction of the shaft walls assault the exterior walls of the carriage and could feel the interior walls becoming warm, caused by the imposing thermal energy caused by friction. A release of tension filled the cramped air shared by the three as they felt the elevator come to its abrupt and final resting place. The lights continued to flicker as the men began to survey the damage and any possible escape routes. They were all fully aware of the lack of buttons on the elevator walls as they saw them bare upon entering. Upon further inspection now, they began to realize how very bare they actually were. No doors for a control panel, or pickaxe, or even a fire extinguisher to be found. They inspected the ground and ceiling looking for a trapdoor. Houston, we have a problem. Over. Trevor's voice came over the radio. Anne and Beck, sitting nearby, still relaxing with the kids, looked over at Jack holding the radio as their smiles quickly faded. The kids, oblivious to whomever Houston was, continued to play cards. Go fish, Delilah said with glee in her voice as she looked to her twin. What seems to be the issue, boys? Over, Jack said as he sat up to listen in. Back in the elevator's cabin, Trevor began explaining their dilemma. Everything was sounding smooth with the elevator. Then it sounded like it hit something, causing it to fall off the cables, I think. It's become badly damaged. The walls are tweaked and caved in, Trevor stated as he looked around with his friends to weigh their options. Just then, Eugene pointed to the corner of the ceiling. There, he noticed a small, thin line protruding from one wall, then making a 90-degree turn and continuing on, ending at the adjacent wall, forming a perfect square, appearing to be the outline of a trapdoor. Wait, I think we found something. Stand by. Over. See what you can do. Be safe. We're on our way. Over, replied Jack, who now had a greater sense of urgency in his voice that transcended through the radio. As the lights kept flickering, Seth pulled out his mag light and pointed it to the surface of the ceiling, focusing in on the outlining in question. Eugene knelt down by Trevor's side and folded his hands together, creating a cradle for Trevor to stand on. Trevor clipped the radio to his belt, put one foot in Eugene's handcrafted footrest, and used the other to spring himself into the air. As soon as he did that, Eugene stood up, maintaining his partner's foot in his hands, and proceeded to catapult Trevor toward the ceiling. Trevor reached his arm out, extended his fingers on his hand to create a flat palm, and as he closed the distance to the ceiling, he forced the trapdoor's panel wide open. Within the same motion of doing so, he grabbed the edge of the now exposed outer top rim of the cabin and hoisted himself up to the roof. Once atop the elevator car, in the dark elevator shaft, he resituated himself in a laid-down position, with his head and arms dangling through the small square hole. He stretched his arms out and grabbed Eugene's hands as they locked wrists. Eugene was then swiftly pulled up to join his friend. Seth kept his light fixed on the two men carrying out the rescue mission. He watched as Eugene was swept up into the ceiling and disappeared into the dark tunnel to join Trevor. Seconds later, Eugene's face reappeared, dangling his arms through the square hole just as Trevor previously had done. Seth turned off his flashlight and buried it in his back pocket. He threw up his arms and grabbed a hold of Eugene as they too locked wrists. Within seconds, the elevator cabin was left empty, its previous occupants now straddling the roof. There were lights dug into the sides of the cement shaft that glowed green, giving an ominous tint to an already chilling environment. As they gazed to the heavens, the three soon became very aware of how incredibly deep they really were. Okay, I think we're fine for now. Over, Trevor announced over the radio. The three of them quickly began contemplating their options. Trevor looked over the side of the cabin's roof and was able to peer through a chasm left by the collision between the walls and the elevator. He focused as well as he could and saw the bottom of the shaft somewhere between 2 and 3 stories down. Then he noticed a ladder built into one of the cement walls. He traced the ladder going up the shaft and noticed that it had sustained severe damage, making it too risky to scale. He signaled to the other two his findings as he began speaking into the radio once again. We got about 2, maybe 3 stories left to hit bottom, and there's a ladder embedded in one of the shaft walls. It's way too far up to travel by the ladder now. Besides, the ladder itself has taken on significant damage. We're going down. We will radio you as soon as we hit bottom. Over. As Trevor clipped the radio back on his belt, Jack sounded a response shrouded in static. Sounds like a plan. We'll start workshopping some ideas from up here to help you get back up. In the meantime, get the hell away from that elevator. It's a potential death trap. Over. Realizing the excellent point coming from the other end of the radio, the three moved with urgency as they made their way, one by one, to the ladder. The ladder had been welded into the wall, giving them ample space to clear the elevator car. One above the other, they started making their descent. Eugene at the bottom, then Trevor, followed by Seth. About a quarter way there, the ladder shifted from being welded into the wall and carved into it to a metal-style ladder, scaling the interior of the shaft itself. Eventually, within moments, they were halfway there. Suddenly, they heard a metallic rumbling from above that sounded all too familiar and was a very unwelcome sound to their ears. They all froze and looked up at the same time. Silence. Then again, the rumbling sound, except this time they witnessed the source of the sound firsthand. The elevator was moving, slowly becoming unwedged as the mechanics to the cables kept trying to do its job, attempting to move the cabin. It quickly surrounded the three in dire straits. "Move," Seth yelled. The three began to rapidly pick up their pace, trying to outrun the Hulk-like object soon to be pursuing them. They only had about 30 feet, a little less than 2 stories to travel. Then 25 feet left to go. Then 20 feet. And then it happened. The metal box above them was freed by the trusty elevator mechanics and began to free fall. Each one of the men held on to the ladder loosely with their hands, placed their feet outside the vertical rails, and slid the rest of the way down. With sounds of absolute chaos from above, only getting louder as the behemoth became closer, the three hit bottom, one by one. First, Eugene, landing in such a way he lost his balance and was propelled backwards through the doorless doorframe, thrusting him into the underground lab. Then Trevor came next. He hit bottom, but was going too fast to stop himself and fell flat onto the cold stone ground. Lastly, Seth scaled down, hit the ground, and like the other two was floored by his speedy entrance. Laying on the floor of the elevator shaft, Seth looked up to see the carriage had nearly caught up to the team, preparing to completely flatten him altogether. Paralyzed with fear upon seeing the impending crisis closing in on him from above, Seth closed his eyes tight and put his hands and arms up toward the rogue elevator car, now on a collision course with his own body. Just then, as the elevator slammed into the ground, a large cloud of dust filled the dimly green-lit room. As the dust settled, Eugene and Trevor lay in hunched-over positions, heavily breathing, each clutching their friend Seth by an underarm after dragging him to safety. While clutching his friend on the ground, Trevor peered over to a blackened, burnt door. On it was fastened a sign singed around the edges. As the words came into focus, he read, Z.U.L. Zancudo Underground Laboratory, Safe Harbor Software, Safe Harbor Inc., Network Power Grid Access. Trevor studied the sign, momentarily losing awareness of the quagmire compounding the three, and reflected with an echoed mind, sounding the first 3 letters out. Z.U.L. Sool. Fuck. After the dust settled, the 3 began regrouping. They each felt utter despair when they saw the pile of rubble that used to be the carriage they once stood in completely block their only way out. Shit, Trevor cried out. Shit, shit, shit. Seth looked over at him. What? The radio. It's gone. It must have fallen off me when I hit the ground. Already realizing that they were in very bad shape, miles below the surface, this last development of being completely cut off from the only help they could count on sent them into panic mode. Pure fear began setting in as the air in the underground laboratory soon grew thick with tension. At the surface level, in the dark concrete structure, outside the closed steel elevator door, a worried group tried communicating by radio to their absent team, who now lay helplessly buried miles below the surface. Jack wasn't giving up. He kept on trying to get a response from the other end of the radio. Trevor, do you read me? Seth? Eugene? Trevor? Come in, someone. Do you read me? Meanwhile, on a vacant corner near the sandy beaches of the town of Esmeralda, a hand reached into a very familiar garbage dumpster, then pulled out a very familiar radio. It was two Beltran Leyva foot soldiers. The man that pulled the radio out heard a very faint voice coming from it. He studied the radio for a second, then turned a knob to increase the volume. He had turned it all the way up to hear the voice on the other end. From the radio he heard, Trevor, do you read me? Seth, Eugene, Trevor, come in, someone. Do you read me? Over. He immediately turned to his fellow soldier, handed him the radio and voiced his orders in Spanish. Inform the Chancellor at once.